In this lesson, we are going to learn about HTTP headers. When our C# application communicates with an LLM API, it sends an HTTP request. But this request does not contain only our prompt or JSON data. It also contains additional information called HTTP headers. These headers help the API understand how the request should be handled. For example, headers can describe the type of data we are sending, how the application is authenticated, and what type of response we expect. So before we start making real LLM API calls, it is important to understand how HTTP headers work. An HTTP request contains different types of information. One important part is called the HTTP headers. Headers provide additional information about the request. They are separate from the actual request body. For example, headers can describe authentication, the type of data being sent, or other information needed by the API. The body, on the other hand, contains the actual data we want to send. So remember, headers describe the request, and the body contains the actual data. HTTP headers are organized using key-value pairs. Each header contains two main parts. First, we have the header name, and then we have the header value. For example, content type is the header name, and application/JSON is the header value. Together, they tell the API important information about the request. So remember, header name, followed by header value. This simple structure is used throughout HTTP communication. An HTTP request is made up of several important parts. First, we have the HTTP method. This tells the server what action we want to perform. Next, we have the URL, or endpoint. This tells the request where it needs to go. Then, we have the HTTP headers. Headers provide additional information about the request. And finally, we have the request body. The body contains the actual data we want to send to the API. Together, these parts create a complete HTTP request. Why do we need HTTP headers? Think about sending a package. The item inside the package is like the request body, but the information attached to the outside tells the delivery service how the package should be handled. HTTP headers work in a similar way. They provide important information about the request. For example, they can describe authentication, the type of data being sent, and the expected response format. So, headers help the API understand and process our request correctly. When working with LLM APIs, there are three important HTTP headers you should understand. The first is authorization. This is commonly used to send your API credentials. The second is content type. This tells the API what type of data we are sending. And the third is accept. This tells the API what type of response our application can accept. These three headers are commonly used when our C# application communicates with an LLM API. Now, let's look at the authorization header. The authorization header is commonly used to send authentication credentials with an API request. For example, your application may send an API key using bearer authentication. The LLM API receives the credential and checks whether it is valid. If the credential is valid, the request can continue. If it is invalid, the API may reject the request. So, the authorization header helps the API verify that your application is allowed to access the service.
Now, let's see what happens when the API checks our credentials. Our C# application sends the request with the authorization header. The LLM API then validates the provided credential. If the credential is valid, the request is accepted, and processing can continue. But if the credential is missing or incorrect, the request is rejected. In many APIs, this may result in a 401 unauthorized response. So always make sure your authentication credentials are correct and secure. Next, let's look at the content type header. The content type header tells the API what type of data we are sending in the request body. When we send JSON data, we normally use content type application/JSON. This tells the LLM API the data inside this request body is in JSON format. The API can then correctly understand and process the data. So remember, content type describes the format of the data we are sending. But what happens if the content type is missing or incorrect? If the API expects JSON, but the request does not correctly identify the data as JSON, the API may not know how to process the request body. As a result, the server may reject the request. For example, you might receive a 415 unsupported media type error. So when sending JSON data, make sure the correct content type is included in your request. Next, we have the accept header. The accept header tells the API what type of response our application can handle. For example, If we want the response in JSON format, we can use accept application/JSON. This tells the API, I can accept a response in JSON format. The API processes our request and returns the response in an appropriate format. So remember, content type tells the API what we are sending, and accept tells the API what we can receive.